and hello everybody. So I have been the vicar of Hodge Hill for the last 11 years. Hodge Hill is a Church of England parish on the east edge of the city of Birmingham. We're a parish of about 20,000 people, and a good third of that parish is the Firs and Bromford estate. Firs and Bromford was built in the 1950s and 60s. Tower blocks, terraces, masonettes, largely rehousing people who had lived in inner city Birmingham, in the Aston area, in what were called back-to-backs at the time. And originally it was one of those kind of ideal garden city outer estates with loads of space for people to spread out, and what they called at the time the kind of villages in the sky, the tower blocks, which were meant to be kind of wonderful centres of community. As we all know, some of those buildings were not quite as wonderful as people thought at the time. And over the years that have followed, it's been a place where, certainly if you measure it in terms of indices of multiple deprivation, one of the stories that could be told about our estate is that most of it is in the top 5 to 10% of most deprived in the country. That's one way of telling the story. Another way of telling the story is to listen to local people's experience of the area. And certainly when I arrived 11 years ago, one of the stories that I heard again and again was that this was a place that was underinvested in. It was overlooked, it was ignored, people's voices weren't heard. Organisations came in when they had funding, promised the world, and then left promptly as soon as the funding ran out, normally 1 or 2 or at the most 3 years later. It was a place where people often felt done to, certainly rather than done with. And even over the years that I've been here, it's been a place where we've experienced quite a lot of asset stripping along the way. The age of austerity has meant that various council-run facilities, for example, have been closed and taken out of the neighbourhood. So that's one bit of the story. Another bit of the story, with my dog collar and my vicar's hat on, is about Hodge Hill Church. The building of St Philip and St James Hodge Hill was built in the 1960s in the posher bit of the parish at the top of Hodge Hill Common. In the 60s, it was a pioneering, cutting-edge bit of church architecture. It had loads of breakout rooms and flexible spaces. There was a badminton court laid out on the nave of the worship space itself. And it was a space that played host to lunch clubs and parents and toddler groups and sports clubs and all kinds of stuff, to the point that people would describe the building as a thriving heart of community. It was a place that was well used, a place that people came to for groups and activities every day of the week. Unfortunately, like a lot of 1960s church architecture, it was also a bit rubbish. It was built largely of concrete, it had lots of flat roofs, and by the early 2000s, there were all kinds of issues with the building itself, and the church congregation were facing a £500,000 repair bill. And one summer, a couple of years before I arrived here, some members of the church congregation went on holiday and came back a week later to find that their beloved building had been demolished. One of the ways that we tell some of our stories here, both of church and of wider neighbourhood, is to point to precipitating events, one of those crises that means that you kind of have no choice but to shift mode. In some communities, that might be a flood. For many of us, it might be a global pandemic, but certainly for Hodge Hill Church, it was the closure of church building that meant a real shift of understanding of how we did church, what mission was, and how we engaged with our community. And certainly when I arrived in 2010, coinciding with the new Conservative government and the age of austerity being announced and beginning, the question from church members was, how do we do this? We don't know how to do church anymore. We don't know how to do mission anymore. We don't know how to engage our neighbours. And what we did, and it was pretty much instinctive rather than following any kind of theory or model, was we mapped our area. We identified where the bumping spaces were that people naturally gather together and encounter each other. And we went out and we listened. We were really clear as a majority middle class congregation in an area that would mostly identify as working class. We were really clear that our job was not to go out and do things to people, or even to go out and do things for people. Our role at that point was to go out with open hands, empty hands, and to listen. And so we listened to our neighbours, and we heard stories from folk locally who'd moved in when the houses were built, of a community that they loved and delighted in, but over the years they felt had gone downhill. We heard stories of folk who'd arrived much more recently as part of the quite radical demographic change in the area, from a majority white community to a community with many different nationalities and ethnicities that we live in today. We heard stories of being welcomed warmly. We heard stories of people who felt like this was just a place where they slept and they did most of their living and their shopping and their praying elsewhere. But more than anything, we heard stories of local people being good neighbours to each other. Christians, Muslims, pagans, people who wouldn't identify with any faith perspective, but people who we heard and saw demonstrating compassion, generosity, trust, friendship, and hope among their neighbours. We heard stories of the postmaster at the local post office who would know when someone was poorly and would find out where they lived or where they were in hospital and would take flowers to them. We heard stories of grandmas picking up their grandchildren from school and picking up loads of others as well and taking them to their house and looking after them until their parents were able to pick them up later. We had countless stories like these. And for us as a church, this was a spur for us to say, stuff is happening in this neighborhood already. People are loving each other, caring for each other. Our role is to be present among those stories, to make friends, to nurture trust, and to celebrate what's happening. And so one of the early things we did was we hosted an event we called Hodgel Unsung Heroes, where we invited 97 local people who'd been nominated by their neighbours as unsung heroes in their community to come together and shared some of their stories. We asked people that evening, if you could find a couple of neighbours to join you, what would you start in your neighbourhood? And we were able to offer a little bit of support and nurture to some of those ideas to help turn them into reality. But more than anything, we learned through those early bits of the journey that one of the things that we as church can do is to inhabit those bumping spaces and to intentionally hear people to speech, intentionally nurture spaces where voices can be heard, where gifts can be unearthed, where passions can be unleashed, and where people can find connections with each other so that they're able to share their passions, gifts, and skills with their neighbours. And for us as a church, that helped stir a vocation which has now become a long-term journey, but has also presented us with all kinds of gifts that we're able to receive and rejoice in along the way, and all kinds of ways in which we've been challenged and have had to learn and change too. So that's a bit of our story.